In the post-Endor period of the Star Wars Legends continuity, Luke Skywalker spent most of his time learning what it meant to be a Jedi Master, but not necessarily in the way you might think. For most of the book, set in the 10 to 20 years after the Battle of Endor, Luke wasn't so much learning how to use or increase his power in the Force as how to limit his use of it. Over this period, and even a bit into the New Jedi Order series just after it, he was repeatedly humbled or had his perspective shifted by different situations and other characters. Giving Luke a bit of a dressing down was a tradition in a lot of the 90s Legends novels, but in my opinion, watching him grow from these experiences, even if I didn't necessarily agree with all the characters criticizing him entirely, was a lot more interesting than just watching him learn to jump 20% higher or something. The criticisms of Luke and his actions from various characters and by various authors weren't exactly coordinated, but they did tend to follow a few specific themes, like him claiming too much responsibility for the actions of others, which is often pointed out as an expression of ego, and the second connected issue is an overuse of his power as a kind of crutch, or a sign that he didn't appreciate what his own use of power could mean for others. So basically, he would internalize the failures of others while not reflecting enough on things he actually had control over. To talk about these, we're probably best off starting with the Dark Empire comics, particularly the first series published from December of 1991 to late 1992, a period during which I was also first published. In this series, Palpatine returns and nearly succeeds at taking down the New Republic. In order to bring Palpatine down from the inside, Luke agrees to become the Emperor's apprentice, along with becoming the Supreme Commander of the Imperial fleet as Vader was, thinking that if he learns some secrets of the dark side, he'll be able to bring the Empire down for good. The plan ultimately works, but as everyone may be able to see coming, he does end up tapping into the dark side, and until Leia comes to try to rescue him, he at least briefly falls to the dark side at least a teeny little bit. This choice is something which gets referenced fairly regularly in the books, almost always critically. One of the times it comes up is a conversation in Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, where Luke is talking to Mara Jade, his future wife and briefly former student. The conversation started with one of their guides on the planet Neroon, named Builder with Vines, getting too close to a swarm of delicious, angry insects, trying to show off his flying and hunting skills, getting himself killed. Luke lamented that he hadn't stopped him, restraining him with the Force or something, and Mara forcefully responded that he would have no right to do that, and that he doesn't get to take responsibility for everyone else's choices. She related this to his decision to join the Emperor, saying, quote, "You weren't thinking, you were reacting, trying to save everyone and do everything, and in the process you came within a split blaster bolt of destroying yourself." She also thinks that him exposing himself to the dark side that way caused a taint which had colored all of his decisions since. She directly highlights that he's so busy taking responsibility and feeling guilty for others' choices, he neglects to really consider his own real failings, listing his failures with a student named Kip Durin, who ended up possessed by a Sith Lord and destroying a whole system. She believes there were things that he could have done to keep Kip in line without just entirely saying that whatever Kip does is a reflection of himself. Particularly, he made the choice to not move the Academy off of Yavin when he learned it was surrounded by dark side energy. And more broadly, she criticized his claiming the title of Jedi Master with only a decade of experience on the job, starting to teach the entire next generation of Jedi Knights with such little experience. Given the outcomes with students at his temple, and the high rate of dropping out, falling to the dark side, or getting literally fried to a crisp in the early days, this doesn't seem like an entirely unfair point. Even worse, some of those early students didn't like this video and subscribed for more. This area, his failures as a teacher, causes Luke probably the most concern throughout his career, and featured prominently in the other major dressing down from one of his students, Corran Horn, in I, Jedi. I don't agree with everything Corran says in this one, but he does point out Luke not giving others enough credit for their own experiences, even if Corran is also being fairly self-absorbed about it by focusing entirely on himself as well. He focuses heavily on the repeated crises that happened in the opening of the Jedi Academy, which we already touched on with Mara, and which were first covered in the Jedi Academy trilogy by Kevin J. Anderson. But then those events were mostly retold from the perspective of Corran in Michael Stackpole's I, Jedi, which is kind of funny considering that Corran isn't even there in the original Jedi Academy trilogy, so you kind of have to picture him being just off-screen a lot of the time. Luke essentially thinks that Corran has no preparation for facing the lure of the dark side if he leaves the Academy, an argument which Corran harshly slaps down, explaining his own past and how often he has come face to face with the dark side. But he also thinks Luke spends too much time blaming himself for how his students ultimately act. Corran was planning to leave the Jedi Academy partially because he thinks Luke, who has no real experience or qualifications as a teacher, dealt too leniently with Kyp Durron after the fact, rather than necessarily focusing on Luke's actions leading up to that like Mara does. Luke was already feeling like a failure with Kyp's issues, Corran and Mara leaving the Academy, and another student named Gantoris frying, not to mention the infiltration of Brachus, an Imperial spy, to his academy. So Corran points out that Luke is putting too much on himself. Being a good teacher is its own skill and one which Luke was not guaranteed to be great at immediately, but that doesn't mean all of his students' successes and failures were entirely on him. It took almost another decade for this point to really hit home for Luke, when he was able to meet a member of the old Jedi Order named Vergere, who had been living with the Yuuzhan Vong, a race of extragalactic invaders, before she escaped with Luke's nephew, Jacen. Luke was unsure about what the Jedi's role in the war with the Yuuzhan Vong should be, partially because the Vong could not be sensed in the Force, and Luke mostly discouraged any Jedi involvement in the fighting, much to the chagrin of the often problematic Kyp Durron and several other Jedi within the Order. Luke felt that if he allowed the Jedi free rein to engage, they would give in to aggression and fall to the dark side. Vergere responded even more harshly than Corran or Mara had in the past, pointing out that Luke wouldn't blame Obi-Wan or Yoda for his failures the way that Luke blames himself for his own students, and constantly centers the discussion of their achievements, or failures, or even just possible failures in the future, as a reflection of himself. Quote, "I," Vergere mocked, I, upon you lies the spiritual health of yourself and all those whom you taught? Is that not ego speaking?" Even if he doesn't internally always frame it this way, he is expressing that his own decision should be good enough for everyone else, and that it's both his responsibility and his right to make these decisions for everyone. He has reasons to be afraid of people repeating his mistakes, but just as often him acting on this fear can push them into repeating them anyways. That fear of the students repeating his mistakes brings us back to the conversation with Mara, where the pair were diving into what one of those longer-term failures of Luke himself had been, something which Luke had been dealing with throughout the Hand of Thrawn duology. The over-reliance on active use of his power, which Luke had already consciously made the decision to stop. At the start of the duology, Luke and Han had been involved in a peace delegation between two species, and Han had informed Luke that one of the species, the Diamolans, hadn't trusted him because he exercised his power too much, and they believed such Jedi inevitably turn dark. Mara explained it with the metaphor of songbirds in a factory, where the sounds of the factory drown out the songbirds nesting above it. The sound of the songbirds were the Force's guidance, and Luke was drowning it out by his own use of the raw power. That concern, which they're talking about like 15 years after Endor, is one which had existed for a long time, even if we just limit the expression of concerns about Luke to his romantic interests in different books. At the earliest, we have Gariel Captason in Truce at Bakura, set in the days just after the Battle of Endor. Her concerns about Luke's power came from her own religious perspective, where she and people on her planet Bakura believed in a kind of cosmic balance where power in one place takes away from power in another, and the same thing happened with good and bad things. If good things happen to you, it means bad things are happening to someone else. Quote, "She believed that every time an individual learned to wield so much power, that diminished a hapless counterpart somewhere in the galaxy. The power-greedy Jedi had puffed up their abilities without regard for the unknown others they destroyed." Ultimately, she comes around on Luke, and at least his intentions, having been biased against Jedi in general from an Imperial upbringing, but it's an interesting point in light of how others like Mara and the Diamolans ended up thinking about his actions in the following decades. Gariel may come around on Luke's intentions, not thinking that he's intentionally trying to diminish others the way she does when they originally met. The way Luke and Jedi would center this power around themselves and then act on it is still a concern for her. The final example we're going to talk about is Akanah from the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy, who was a member of another Force tradition called the Adepts of the White Current, or the Falanasi. They were a much more pacifist tradition, and Akanah was very off-put by Luke's regular use of his power for violence. He kills a stormtrooper while they're together, and she strongly objects, questioning whether it was necessary. When she pushes him on how much thought he had put into restraint, he concedes that he, quote, "wasn't particularly worried about whether I killed him or not." Akanah expresses worry that he's not mindful enough of the power he holds, echoing some of those concerns we've heard from the others who think his concern is too often placed on his feelings of responsibility for others rather than his own actions. He's doing what he does out of a desire to protect people, which can be good, but he is also taking a lot of these choices into his own hands. Akanah didn't want the stormtrooper to be killed to protect her in that moment, but Luke made that choice for her, and she expands this concern for what it means for the Jedi he's training. For Luke, the relationship between the Republic and the Jedi is a voluntary one, and the Jedi operate on their principles rather than as a government military force. But Akanah points out that the New Republic funds the Academy, and he relies on their hardware, creating at least an implicit obligation of the Jedi to the state. You can question whether her seemingly complete dedication to remaining uninvolved in the galaxy is the correct stance, but I don't think she's fundamentally wrong here. The concern she's expressing plays heavily into the Clone Wars, and as this timeline moved on, it would become increasingly true of the New Jedi Order as well, as Luke did tie them much more closely to the New Republic and Galactic Alliance as time went on, to sometimes pretty disastrous effect. We could also talk a lot about attacks from political opponents like Borsk Falia, Chief of State of the New Republic. There are some more institutional critiques of the Jedi that come up, which I think could be interesting to look at on their own, but that's going to do it for today's look at how Luke, despite his kind of prestigious place in the galaxy, was never immune to this kind of criticism. There are certainly books that try to portray him as an unassailable action hero, and I think a lot of these critiques that we're talking about today came in response to those. Either way, thank you for watching. Special thanks to the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now, whose support makes this channel possible. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.